There's a lot of kids out there who need your help, and a donation could potentially save them. Link to my fundraiser is in the description.
Gunvolt! He hurled his thunderbolt!
There's a lot of indie devs out there who want to make games that harken back to much older generations, while still feeling in place in today's market. You've probably seen a lot like this, but out of all of them, one of the most common indie studios that has their name attached to games with this retro feel is Inti Creates. Now, in the 2000s and very early 2010s, the studio was actually commissioned by larger companies to help develop several games, with the most notable examples being the Mega Man Zero series, the Mega Man ZX series, and Mega Man 9 and 10. However, they eventually began to develop and publish their own games, with their debut being Azure Striker Gunvolt, releasing for the Nintendo 3DS in August of 2014. And it's clear that the goal of this game was for Indie Creates to show their love for Mega Man and give fans an experience like it to scratch an itch that Capcom was not willing to scratch at the time. And it proved to be successful as a PC port came quickly, and we would eventually see a sequel in the form of Azure Striker Gunvolt 2 in 2016. And then, a third entry recently came out, and there's a whole sub-series that they eventually made, but one step at a time here. A while back, I had the idea to dedicate a review marathon to the Azure Striker Gunvolt series, in a similar way to what I did with Sly Cooper, but after thinking it over a little more, since I'm not super devoted into being perfect at these games, and since there are plenty of elements shared between them, I thought it would be better to fit all the current games into one video. Okay, not literally, I'm only going to be covering the main Gunvolt games here, those being the original, 2, and the recently released 3. We'll get to the Luminous Avenger X games later. I overall do remember enjoying the original game back when I played it on the 3DS in 2016, but I also remember a lot of things bugging me at best and infuriating me at worst, especially around the end, and that really made it harder to come back for me. And for this revisit, I figured looking at the 3DS version wasn't ideal since this version will eventually be gone with the wind when the 3DS eShop closes next year. So I went ahead and rebought it on my Switch via the Striker Pack, and let me just say, I think this and supposedly the other console versions make the 3DS version null and void, because they did change some minor things and made a couple of moments less irritating, and the game runs at 60 frames per second on consoles as opposed to 30 on the 3DS. I do appreciate these, but you're not exactly getting cheated out by getting the 3DS version, since it is the same game at its core. Though in hindsight, since it's available on every modern console in this day and age, which one you get is all up to you. But how is that game to begin with? Well, let's find out how the adventures of the Azure Striker first started. In the far-off future, not sure of the time frame, a group of people who would become known as adepts have harnessed sensible powers, which are basically superpowers that can range from artillery manipulation to control over an element like fire, water, electricity. I'm sure you can piece together how this all works. While it seems like everything is well and good between them and normal humans, thanks to an organization known as Sumeragi, in actuality, Sumeragi is subjecting them to experimentation in an effort to control them for their own gain, something an organization known as Quill is fighting to expose and help restore the livelihood between adepts and humans. I hope you don't mind me skimming over Quill, because two of the members don't really have that many interesting things to offer, despite the amount of in-stage dialogue they get. The ones the story does have more with are Asimov, the leader and mentor of the group, and our main character, Gunvolt, an adept who has the ability to control lightning, and has gained enough notoriety to warrant the title of the Azure Striker. The mission they start on when the game begins is to find an adept that can manipulate other adepts by singing Lumen, also known as the Muse. But when Gunvolt actually gets to Lumen, he finds out she's being held there against her will, not wanting to cause harm, and that she's also a Settima, which is a manifestation of someone else's power. In this case, this little girl named Joel, who Gunvolt finds trapped in a machine. Unable to bring himself to kill her, he instead chooses to rescue Joel and give her a place to stay, which I am totally happy he did, because Joel is baby and I will do everything to protect her. Thing is, that kinda conflicts with Asimov's orders, leaving Gunvolt to essentially defect, but then he starts accepting contract jobs from them, which lets him go toe-to-toe with the agents of Sumeragi. I never got into this story, as there's very little connection between protecting Joel and the missions you do until endgame. Even if the decision early on is a decently cool character moment, the fact that Gunvolt defects means absolutely nothing, and Quill barely gets involved in keeping Joel safe. It's like the story had an idea, but then didn't do anything with it, and when they try to do something with it, the only notable thing it delivers is a twist that's just straight up dumb. It comes in after the main threat is dealt with, and the story was never building up to it to begin with, making it feel unearned and just put in there to have a twist and different endings. And even the endings feel hollow, and leave me questioning what was even the point of the decisions made here. Like I said, I don't play these games for the story, but it feels like they had interesting ideas, but they just remained ideas and delivered nothing. Characters are overall hit or miss, but the hits are worth noting. Gunvolt is a pretty decent protagonist. He's overall serious about calling out wrongdoing, but he does have a general compassion towards those he cares about, even adopting a few father traits when looking after Joel, and that does make for some admittedly sweet moments between these two, especially in the Talk to Joel option on the main menu. Joel is also very likable. It's understandable how withdrawn she is, given she's been in captivity for a while, but when with Gunvolt, it's really nice just to see her be herself. The 7 adepts you go up against are also a lot of fun, as they have plenty of quirks that make them more memorable than your average Rolemaster or Maverick. Some notable examples are Merrick, who is just so done with everything and would much rather chill and play video games, which to that I say, me too, dude. Stratos, who is apparently beyond recognizable from who he initially was, and can be legit creepy, and Elise, who has a split personality going on where the dominant altar pretty much sees every enemy as just an annoying fly, while the submissive altar is very timid and lacking in willpower, even apologizing for attacks during the boss fight at some points. Sadly, I don't remember too much about the other members of Quill, and the main villains are really weak. The first one, Nova Tsukiyomi, is such a nothing character, and despite the fact that he gets a few scenes before the final stages, his presence in the story doesn't feel all that imposing, and the other one is involved with the twist explained earlier, and like us with how ham-fisted that felt, the moments he does get as a villain are not taken advantage of, making him all the more underwhelming as an antagonist. So narratively, the game does not keep my attention, but the presentation and gameplay do manage to pick up the rest of the slack. The game primarily uses a sprite-based art style not too far from what Inti creates today with the Mega Man Zero and ZX series, and it overall looks great. I really appreciate how well each character sprite is animated, with Gunvolt and the bosses especially getting a lot of good attention. I love the particle effects they give for the flash field with the screen around the field growing dimmer, and when you or a boss use a special attack, there's these wonderfully drawn sprites and text effects that really pop out. And like I said before, unless you're playing on the 3DS, the game runs at a smooth 60 frames per second, which I always love. I also do enjoy the dialogue portraits and the story art the game uses, but I'm not too big on every character only having one dialogue portrait. It makes it hard to fully understand what the character is feeling at a given moment, and it feels like a budgeted decision. Like, I'm okay with cutscenes being presented like this, but again, it feels like they presented an idea but didn't go the full 9 yards, leading to meager payoffs. Another thing I'm not crazy on is how they handle mid-stage dialogue. The idea, I'm not against, and I admit there's a select number of exchanges that were okay when watching footage, but when playing the game, it's much harder to pay attention to them. Not to mention they get unnecessarily huge and make the UI of the game look really messy. I respect the attempt, especially given it wasn't in the 3DS original, but it definitely could have been a lot better, which isn't helped by the voice acting. I mean, the voice acting overall is fine, but the thing is, it's in Japanese. I know some Japanese, but I am far from fluent in it, so in stage, it doesn't give me something to enjoy as I'm going along, though you can turn it off on repeat visits, and I don't get much out of it in cutscenes, which results in either reading subtitles or just skipping them entirely. Music-wise, I don't remember a ton of it, but I will say it does fit the mood the game is going for. And for one issue I have presentation-wise, you can really tell this is an upscale 3DS game in a lot of cases. There's a lot of text that's very pixelated, some elements of the menu's UI were definitely more suited for the 3DS, and the aforementioned in-stage dialog boxes didn't need to be this big. There isn't anything that's majorly wrong with the presentation, like I never ran into any game-breaking bugs. My issues are mostly small, and mostly related to some areas outside of normal gameplay, and it's easy to tell the small cut corners the game made in transition to console. The game still looks very solid, and I do appreciate the small number of updates it made to help out even more. And on that note, let's get into what makes the gameplay fun. And if you've played a Mega Man title, specifically a Mega Man X or Zero entry, a lot of this might be familiar to you. After the intro stage, you're given the choice between 6 stages that you can beat in any order you so please, with the aforementioned Subaragi adepts being this game's Robot Masters or Mavericks. There's a mid-stage after beating half of them, and after beating all 6 stages, you go through a couple of final stages and then beat the bad guy at the end. But in terms of how Gunvolt handles, the game does try to do something new. Gunvolt does have a gun, but this thing is not a Mega Buster. I mean, you could use it like one, but that only leads to most enemies taking really long to kill. So here's what you should be doing. The bullets are actually tags that latch onto any foe they touch, which makes them more susceptible to the flash field. An electric sphere that on its own chips away at the enemy's health and blocks some projectiles. But with the tagged enemy in range, it lets loose lightning that repeatedly shocks them. It feels very unnatural at first, but it's something I think you'll get the hang of in due time. I grew attached to this way of attacking because you can tag any enemy up to 3 times, with 3 levels of power indicated by ring color, and you can tag as many enemies as you want depending on your loadout. These make for fun ways to approach each enemy, make for some sophisticated level design that makes effective use of it, and allow you to redirect priorities to trying to move around and dodge what you need to, helped up with the flash shield essentially allowing you to slow your descent down. And I said depending on your loadout, because after you defeat more bosses, you get access to more guns which have different ways of tagging, and have a different number of tags altogether. Now, this part isn't like Mega Man, as they are not themed after a boss, and don't act as weakness weapons, they just allow for different forms of range. I didn't find much use for these to be honest, except for Naga, which I could use similar to my default weapon, but with 5 tags instead of 3, though I didn't find much use for the charge shot, and for Orochi, which sprouts this drone that fires in 5 different directions, which I found very useful for specific enemy formations and bosses. The others I didn't think much of, but I do like how you have the choice to switch between them during the stage, so you can go with which one you like, or prepare for an upcoming boss. Combine this with SP skills that can range from healing to super attacks that you can map to the right stick, and there can be plenty of ways you can go about each level and each fight. Though the flash shield is the main mechanic to utilize for combat, there is a catch to it all. You may have noticed this fluctuating percent at the top left. That's your EP meter, which goes down when you use the flash field. It's ideal to watch this thing when it starts getting low, because if it overheats, you can't use it for a while, meaning you have fewer defensive options and you're a more vulnerable target. Thankfully, by double tapping down, you can instantly refill it and keep moving, so pay attention to it. The bar under GV helps out with this a lot, so thank you to whoever included that. This meter also goes down if you use Prevasion, a skill that prevents attacks and certain hazards from harming you. On paper, this seems very unbalanced, and admittedly, it kind of is depending on the level, but honestly, I don't mind it, as relying on it becomes heavily discouraged as some attacks and hazards drain through it fast, and in a few instances, instantly deplete it. So in hindsight, I see this as nothing more than a failsafe. Same thing with Anthem, which can trigger if you die, if it feels like it. While in this state, you get infinite health, infinite jumps, and infinite EP, which is insane. I don't normally like to go in these, as you don't get any points for going into the state, but if you just want to beat the game, it's certainly there. Relying on Prevasion and Anthem isn't great, because after a while it'll start messing with your score by getting rid of all your kudos, which are bonus points you get by doing things like finishing enemies or a boss with a skill, defeating multiple enemies at once, defeating them while airborne, that kind of thing. Even though I don't normally care about getting the best score most of the time, even I found this as a nice incentive to try and think of how I can take on specific formations, and I ended up getting more out of the game when I tried this, and beating the level as fast as possible. That's appreciated because at the end of each level, you're ranked on how well you did, and if you manage to get better ranks and find medals in each level, you can gain some bonus money and bonus materials. Now you'll get some of those regardless of the stage, but doing well in these will lead to a better experience in the synthesizing shop. Here you can take money and materials you got, and use them to craft equipment that upgrades you in some form, from something as small as making health restoration items heal you more, to something as big as taking less damage, or giving you a new move from an air dash to a double jump. I'm personally a little mixed on this. On the one hand, the levels don't account for these, so they can be used to make the game easier, which is cool, and I can see why someone would believe it incentivizes doing well in stages, because it leads to getting more out of the game, which I do feel, even if I'm just going for the upgrades I feel like having, since it's unlikely you'll get them all in a single run. But on the other hand, while money is never a problem, the bonus materials you get are random, and so equipment requires a bit of one material, so this process will require grinding and replaying stages multiple times over in order to just get one thing you want, which can mess with the pacing depending on how you win about things. Now, I don't think you'll need them all at the end of the day, as I don't think the game is that taxing, but I still feel like there was a better way to handle all of this. Challenges help out a tad, but only a tad. While they are certified to give you the material promised, there's unfortunately a lot of problems with this system. You can only unlock a set of challenges after you've beaten the stage, which I would be fine with, except for the fact that anything you did in your first visit doesn't count towards them. Like, I'm able to beat the grand majority of these stages just fine with the B rank or higher, but the game didn't count it because it either wasn't unlocked or I didn't have it equipped. Oh yeah, you need to equip a challenge for it to count, and the game will only allow 3 at a time. And even if you exceed what you needed to do, there's a chance that another challenge will open up asking you to do it again just a bit better than the last. Like, say you got an A rank on the stage to fulfill the B rank quest, an A rank one will pop up, meaning that's another replay if you're aiming to complete them all. Honestly, unless you want something for the shop, I would not recommend bothering with these. The game took something that should be simple yet effective, and turned it into complete padding with how much it's asking you to revisit stages several times over. At least the levels themselves are pretty enjoyable. There's nothing in here that's super extravagant, but I do like the set pieces and settings a lot of them have to offer. Like the media tower actually feels like you're climbing up a tower, and has these launchers that make getting around super fun, especially with the flash field. The underwater base has this section where you run away from rising water levels to avoid drowning, and if it catches up to you, you don't drown immediately, but your flash field immediately burns out. and also the mid-stage, which is almost like a maze of some form, where a wrong turn will lead you to an enemy rush. Granted, enemy rushes are pretty common, but I found it cool how I could avoid a lot of them if I knew which routes to take. And the bosses, which are all about what you'll be dealing with most of the game, are easily a highlight. With how zippy Gunvolt is, each one throws in a little surprise that requires good dexterity and a keen eye on where to keep up. And they're really fun to fight, with my particular favorites being Elise and Copen. To mirror her split personality, there's two beings you have to target during the fight, but on top of not being way too exploitive of things that can go wrong with this concept, it feels like the two are in sync with one another and teach you how important it is to multitask when you need to. I used to hate this fight when I first played on the 3DS, but since then it's kind of grown on me. Bonus points to the rematch going even farther with the chaos. Meanwhile, Copeland actually fights you with abilities a player character would have, and actually uses attacks based on the 6 adepts, which is neat. Heck, in the first fight, he'll only use attacks based on the 3 adepts you've already taken down, adding to the strategy of who you should tackle first. That said, I don't necessarily have an order I like to go in with these levels. I don't find this game that hard, unless you're really taking your score seriously, as there's always a way to easily take down each foe, even if it isn't always obvious, and even without provision, it's not hard to get accustomed to each layout. The game also doesn't have lives, and the checkpoint system doesn't usually get too punishing. At least until the final few stages. Yeah, gotta be honest, for as fun as most of this game is, I think the quality takes a pretty big decrease by endgame. There isn't much level design to go over with these, and whatever level is there is really basic and only serves to fight enemies for score. They start off by reusing a tougher version of this mech you fought at the beginning of the game, 4 times, and from there you're basically going through each of the bosses again, with Elise getting something neat, and Merrick getting something kind of annoying. At least it doesn't get bottomless pits like he did in the 3DS original. That said, even though I like this boss lineup, it dropped the ball pretty hard with the last 2 bosses. Nova's fight starts out with him protected by a barrier that you can only take down by shocking the Lumen projection, which is always right next to him, meaning unless you're using the flash field, at point blank, his health is barely going down. His attacks on their own aren't too bad, but the method you're supposed to damage him makes things way more annoying than it really should. Then we get to the second phase, where you're supposed to shock these drones in order to keep a barrier down and shock the core. But it goes back if you stop shocking for just a moment, which you need to do in order to dodge some of these attacks. There's a select few that are annoying to avoid, even with the flash field, hover, and provision, and I should mention there's also bottomless pits at the edge of the arena, which makes things feel ridiculously cramped. Oh, and he chucks a meteor at you at the end that instantly kills you, and if you die at any point, you go back to the beginning of Phase 1. Yay! Any long-time viewers of mine might recognize this as one of my least favorite bosses in gaming, and yep, that still applies. Even taking out the bad memories I had with this boss back when I first got to it, this fight in general is just not very well designed. And the last one I'm not going to talk about in order to avoid spoilers, but let's just say it uses the mechanics of the game in extremely questionable and unorthodox ways, is annoying to get even any damage on, and overall just really left a bad taste in my mouth. Any long-time viewers of mine probably know who I mean. But then there's one more thing about the endgame I really don't like. The level design doesn't offer a lot of room for exploration, and mostly focuses on action set pieces and score, which is fine, but I don't mind it when it hides extra goodie like bunny or medals off in a corner to get, because they only have extras. I am not okay with them hiding collectibles that are required to get the game's true ending. Yes, in order to get the true conclusion to the game, you literally have to comb the 6 main levels and the mid-stage for 7 jewels, along with some of them being in places that act like a super elaborate puzzle, or are in blink and you miss it locations. I do not get the point of this, as it doesn't contribute to score, and it doesn't give you anything else for going out of your way. And if you didn't know about this before, this is going to leave an even worse taste in your mouth. And what's even worse is that you have to give these things a jolt in order for it to make you the thing you need in order to finish the game. But the thing is, after beating all the adepts, she gets kidnapped, leaving you unable to give her the last one until the bad ending is finished. Which means, after getting it, you essentially have to fight one of my least favorite bosses in gaming again before the true final sequence is set in motion. I don't get what this accomplishes. This is padding, and it knocks the game down by quite a big notch. I know I just unloaded quite a few negatives I had, some of which sounded pretty heated, but I want to reiterate, the game is still really fun, until the end where it takes quite a big plunge. For all that it did bother me, there was something I got while playing the game that felt nice. It felt like I was doing a lot of this because I legitimately wanted to, and I was enjoying myself. I think you'll get more out of this if you're a player that takes score seriously, but I got my kicks just playing through it normally, seeing how well it held up. So in a way, while it is very rough in some areas, in-game especially, I'm still recommending you give it a shot. It doesn't ask for a lot out of you, and I think you'll enjoy this, and maybe even get better at it should you decide to go that route. But if the endgame ends up being a massive turnoff, including to the point where you don't want to get the true ending, I totally understand that, and that's why, while I enjoy Azure Striker Gunvolt, I don't think it's anything that wonderful. Azure Striker Gunvolt 2, on the other hand, So, the original Azure Striker Gunvolt proved to be a relatively strong success as the company's first solo adventure. And so, that meant they had something going, and the opportunity to keep it going was there. I made sure they did take those steps with an OVA and a PC port of the original the following year, but then comes Azure Striker Gunvolt 2, released to the 3DS in late 2016, before seeing a port to the Switch the following year, ports to both the PC and PS4 in 2020, and a port to Xbox systems just recently. When this game came out, I was actually pretty fresh with the first game on the 3DS, and news about a new entry was definitely something that excited me. And hey, since I was now making some money of my own, that means I was actually able to get it the day it came out. And I remember enjoying the game more and more from every playthrough I did, and I came to appreciate how much the devs had a better grasp on what they wanted to do, and what they designed around it. So needless to say, I was very much looking forward to revisiting this. And yes, like Gunvolt 1, I will be looking at the version on the Striker Pack for the Switch. So, let's get into this. Sometime after the events of the first game, with Sumeragi being put in quite a predicament, Gunvolt now works as a solo agent to fully take out any remnants left behind, with the help of Joel. Oh yeah, spoilers for the ending of the last game. Through a big event, Joel is killed, but her soul now resides within Gunvolt's Septima, and it assumes Lumen's form. So that's definitely good. After an event where he manages to stop an airship from crashing and rescue a girl from a nearby hospital, whose name is Metil and is the little sister of Copen from the last game, both he and Copen are suddenly ambushed by a group of adepts from a cult called Eden, led by the returning Zonda, who Copen thought he killed last time. Zonda's here to continue the project on the Muse through her own means, different from what Sumeragi wanted. Yes, Zonda's a female. The form you knew from earlier is a mirage, something that's part of her Septima. And she actually starts by trapping Joel inside a mirror and shattering it, scattering the shards among himself, the other Eden adepts, and Copen. Now, Joel's still with Gunvolt after this, but she has been substantially weakened, meaning we not only got to stop what Zonda has planned, but also try to get Joel's power back, at least on Gunvolt's side. Copen just wants adept eradication and the safety of Metil. From there, the plot splits off into pathways for both Gunvolt and Copen, both with their own objectives and twists. The story isn't anything incredible, but I must say, I had a lot more fun following it this time around. What I described earlier happens before you choose a single adept to fight, so there's definitely a lot more happening this time around, and a lot more at stake here. But it's never front-loaded. Everything is both shown and told very naturally, where it's easy to have fun where the game wants you to, and give you a moment to really think about something when it wants you to. It also embraces the world and capabilities of adepts a lot more than the first game, whereas that one kept it really simple and to the point. Here they just have fun and let everyone shine, which is really nice to see. Gunvolt's not any more complex than he initially was, but with Joel's new status and his new comrades, I feel like he's given enough to not feel like a leftover. I like how more expressive Joel is this time around, and Quinn and Zhao, while not anything amazing, are eons better than the Quill team from last time, if only because their interactions with Gunvolt can be legitimately irritating at times. It's also really funny how Joel actually sees Quinn as competition for GV. I get plenty of laughs when it comes to certain moments where Joel essentially tries to wall Quinn from him. The increased amount of screen time Copen gets really does him wonders. We not only learn a bit more about why he came to hate adepts so much, but his story shows that he's plenty capable as a scientist with all that he makes, and he is very soft in regards to Metil, who is also enjoyable. The fact that she can't speak does lend to both adorable character moments and adorable ways they present her dialogue, as she's writing her words on a screen. Then there's Copen's AI companion Lola, who not only gets a cool humanoid form from the mirror shard Copen got, but her cheerfulness offsets Copen's anger in a way that works, making interactions between her and her boss delightful. Nori's just straight up Alfred Pennyworth, but I mean that as a good thing. She's cool. Zonda has way more presence about her, and can be legitimately creepy at times, and the other adepts are so full of character and add more life to this cast, with my personal favorite easily going to Tessio, as he just doesn't care about what's happening as long as he gets under other people's skin. It's kind of hilarious how a lot of his dialogue is written like someone's trying way too hard to be hip and cool, and it's hilarious in the context of this game, especially when his own allies tell him to screw off. With how much the writing improved from both the storytelling and comedic value, I had a lot more fun following this story than I did with the last one, and I didn't notice that many glaring issues upon this revisit. Graphically, it doesn't look that much better than the first in terms of sprite quality and animation, but I noticed the colors in some of the environments were more saturated and vibrant this time around. In the first game, I felt that most of them resorted to a similar shade regardless of base color. Here, I feel like the base color was more of a priority, which I appreciate. Another thing I appreciate is there being more character portraits this time around. Gunvolt and Copen still only have like 2, but for other characters there's quite a bit more, so story sequences don't feel quite as stale. But the in-stage dialogue issue still applies. While I do enjoy the exchanges more, the way they're presented in a stage wasn't fixed, making it still hard to pay attention to them while playing the game, and there still not being an English dub still hurts it. Also, likewise with the Gunvolt 1 Switch port, you can definitely tell this is an upscaled 3DS game. But also likewise with that, we've got 60 frames per second at all times, though when stopping on an enemy as Copen, I tend to notice quite a few pauses, but since it's only during one specific action, I guess it's not that big of a deal. So you might be looking at this footage and are curious as to why I prefer this, because it looks borderline identical to the last one, And a lot of areas, you would be right. This is built off the same engine, and not a ton about Gunvolt has changed, as everything about his flash show remains intact, and he has no new guns. But there are a select number of changes and new additions. The amount of tags he can get on enemies is no longer tied to the gun he's using, but rather the clip he has currently equipped. The game is designed around the 3 tag limit, but I felt like changing it to this was a decent call, as now this means that all the guns GV gets are about as useful as each other, so it's up to you on how you want to use them. Not to mention it adds a lot more to consider when it comes to customization without overcomplicating things, which is great. I mean, collecting items from stages has not changed, so everything I said about that there applies here, but I will admit because of the increased variety and some other reasons I'll get into later, I enjoyed looking through all this to see what exactly fits my playstyle. But he's also got some new skills to use as well, with 2 of the most important ones, Dragon Sphere and Crash Bolt, you get by finding in stages, encouraging exploration, and adding more to look forward to overall. Those 2 don't cost any SP to use, meaning there's more ways to approach fights. The levels he goes through help out these changes a ton. They take better advantage of the theme they have, present way more fun and challenging obstacles than before, and even have a degree of exploration. I'm still not passionate about going for the best possible score, but I definitely felt more of a drive to do well here because of the steps forward. But I still felt like it did a great job appealing to my side of wanting to see where everything is, as there are some secrets that are creatively hidden. P.S. They don't make you do this to get the true ending. Thank you! With the combination of improved level design and tweaked gameplay, Gunvolt's campaign felt a lot more satisfying, and it's something that I think I can definitely revisit just to have a good time. But I said things like path splitting and Gunvolt's campaign for a reason. Let's talk about Copen now! In one of the biggest advancements this game chose to make, Copen has his own campaign that makes up the other half of Gunvolt 2, and I'm glad they were willing to go out of the way to introduce another playable character while still keeping things focused. Everything about tagging, blasting, and score attacking is still at the forefront, but it's what Copen decides to do with it that makes him stand out. Copen's gun doesn't tag anyone, it just depletes health like it would in any other game, so theoretically, you could play the game like that, but here's what you really should be doing. His dash is what tags enemies, and while he can tag them up to 3 times, the homing shots you can dish out from it are more than enough, but the real fun begins once you realize that Copen can air dash horizontally and diagonally, as well as influence its direction once he's chosen to fly off one way, as well as keep the momentum going if you manage to bounce off a wall, as well as do a short mid-air hover once it's done. The air dash is what makes Copen's gameplay, as his levels are designed around using this as much as possible to get a feel for your surroundings, as well as keep the chain going. And if he manages to hit an enemy with an air dash, he regains a bullet, which is what you need to air dash in the first place. Bullets can also be used for prevasion, so if you turn that on, keep that in mind. Also like Gunvolt, he can recharge on the ground, but unlike Gunvolt, doing this while airborne also doubles as a ground stomp that damages any surrounding enemies. Even if I don't normally use this for combat, getting back on the ground immediately was very useful in keeping the pace going. If Gunvolt's lack of weapons themed after bosses was disappointing to you, Copen's got you covered as he actually gains some after beating bosses like in Mega Man. These are a blast to use in combat sequence, but I was also happy to see how some of them were even multi-purpose. The Twin Sail Bunker is already destructive and handy as an offensive weapon, but it's amazing how you can also use this as a super jump since Copen can't dash straight up or straight down. Got a ton of use out of this for vertical areas. The Hailstorm Blades and Hydro Zapper were great for making health go down faster and piercing some enemies with shields, and the Broad Circuit is a shotgun that's pretty much an insta-kill to any tagged enemy that isn't a boss. Earlier it was saying the levels did a great job providing more things like exploration in order to draw in more players, and I feel like the design of Copen's levels highlight this the most. They have a lot of large and open areas that you can survey, and trying to get a feel for the formation of enemies is almost like a puzzle if you want to get the best score, which I think is a great change of pace. Gunvolt and Copen have a small handful of shared levels, but they both have ones that are specifically catered to how they play, and the shared levels definitely account for both of their abilities. Heck, in the cases of the ice level, Copen can access the secret route that GV can never go on, try as he might. Or in one of the last levels, they literally designed different paths for both characters despite it being a shared level, which is also neat. Copen also has a shop of sorts, but his equipment works a little differently. Instead of doing things like putting clothes or gear on, he can install chips into his armor to give him some sort of boost, which range from prevasion, to stuff like adding extra bullets, to stuff like increasing the recharge rate of his weapon meter, which are also fun to use. The biggest hurdle to deal with is how many slots each chip takes. You get more by leveling up and exploring, so that's great, but it's still going to be something you're going to have to keep in mind. Going over the limit will result in consequences like decreased defense, so I guess you theoretically could go to stages overloaded if you plan to get reckless, but me personally, if there's a big drawback for going nuts with equipment, then I don't exceed the limit. Honestly, even if I enjoy playing as GV, I actually had a little bit more fun with Copen. I think the way he manages to keep chains going is interesting, and giving this kind of freedom to the player helps the appreciation for a lot of these design choices in the levels, especially my personal favorite, the Isle of Dreams, which has a ton of different rooms to look into, and thus different ways to get to the end, and closes off with not only a fight against the Adapter of the Day, Azrock, but also a boss fight against the Grand Torta, a giant robot that takes up just about the entire screen and has an artillery that really does let you get the hang of how Copen handles. This fight's amazing, but it's not like the other bosses are left hung to dry. They're climactic as well and have their own way of testing you. I will say that I do think there are select few attacks that are designed more with Copen's moveset in mind and not so much Gunvolt's, and vice versa, which is noticeable since the adepts you don't go after in one campaign appear in the final stages in the other one, but since they have a ton to offer regardless, I can forgive this. Another thing I appreciate is that if you use their respective weaknesses as Copen, they don't get stunned or anything. Their health just drains faster. This is a great way to still make the fight engaging and convince you to train with just your gun and the Stellar Spark, your default special weapon, rather than just use the weakness and maybe manipulate the boss's patterns like in most Mega Man titles. Though I will say I find it hilarious how Teseo is weak to his own weapon. Teseo, buddy, did you take weapon weakness classes from Metal Man?
I don't know. Did you take video classes from the guy with 0 subs? Lol, pod.
Remind me to never ask this guy questions ever again. If I did have one big issue with the game, aside from the necessary padding with the challenges, though to give it credits at least a step up from last time, and the item shop still being iffy in terms of how it's set up, despite getting rid of the jewel hunting, there's still a true ending. How you get it is by beating both campaigns. And then beating the final stage again with both characters to see their respective ending. This means, to see both their endings, that's 4 playthroughs of the final level you have to do, and that level not only has the Zonda battle, but also a boss rush. Okay, that's not only padding, that's only putting it in there just because the first game did it. I think it would have worked a lot better if A, the true ending commenced after you beat your second character's campaign, or B, have it accessible via the level select menu. I mean, the ensuing battle you get as part of the ending is amazing, but come on, we didn't need this. With all that said, I absolutely loved Azure Striker Gunvolt 2. It manages to tweak a lot of my issues with the first game, and added a ton more while I was at it. And it's a game I know I can come back to for a great time. This revisit was so pleasant that I even went and did some of the secret missions before moving on, which redesigns Copen's levels for Gunvolt and vice versa, and I was still into it. I even tried out the score attack mode, which doesn't let you use any equipment or evasion, and it's through this mode where the adds from Gunvolt 1 make a comeback complete with modified attack patterns, which is awesome. There's also a speedrun mode with a similar setup if you're interested, so in terms of both replay value and fun factor, Gunvolt 2 easily blows the original out of the water. So one of the main reasons I would recommend the first one is to appreciate how many steps in the right direction the sequel took. I don't know what else to say other than definitely check this out. This game is a jolt of excitement I know I can come back to when I want some fun 2D action. That just leaves the most recent game of the trilogy, Azure Striker Gunvolt 3, the first mainline entry to be released on consoles, first and foremost. Now for this one, since it is so recent, I'm going to warn you that I will be spoiling a select number of gameplay moments within the review, as well as keep story spoilers to a relative minimum, as well as give myself to play through the game at least twice, once I let my personal feelings take the wheel and just get a feel for everything, and a second time to have another look with the hype not as high. That said, I am happy to see that after 6 years, we're continuing the story after Gunvolt 2. I mean, yeah, sure, a few years after that game we'd get Luminous Avenger X, which continued Copen's style of game, and then a sequel to that 3 years later, but again, one step at a time here. It's been so long since we have word of this game even existing. Like, it was a concept upwards until mid-2020 where it was finally revealed, but no matter what, I was excited for it. And here we are now. Let's see how they were able to keep things going. So with everything about the Muse finally being settled, and Gunvolt seemingly living a happy life, Gunvolt 3 decides to let his powers go under an evolution, and it has sadly brought upon more harm than good. He's now what's known as a primal dragon, which can have the power to bring about the destruction of the world. Fearing this would enter the worst, he willingly surrenders to Sumeragi, who then seal him away using Glyphs. Decades pass and we're now following a new protagonist, Kirin, a battle priestess raised by Shadow Yakumo, a subdivision of Sumeragi focused on keeping anything supernatural in check. The two groups develop a bit of friction with each other after what happened in the last 2 games, and Kirin is then tasked with infiltrating one of their facilities, and there she happens to find Gunvolt and return him to normal, before turning him into a dog because she's not used to purifying a primal dragon. I'm guessing someone was playing Twilight Princess that day. Gunvolt's transformation was unfortunately a catalyst for other adepts, as they soon begin to transform into primal dragons, and now it's up to Gunvolt and Kirin to quell their rampage. And that's only the first half of the game. After rescuing 4 primal dragons and actually recruiting them to your team, an adept group called Atems come by to take what's known as the Binding Brands, which are similar to Glyphs but stronger, and use it to use Septima in their own way, so they basically become the focus of the second half. I do say that even though it is a little jarring seeing a time jump and a change of focus from what the previous 2 games were focused on, I've become a little more fond of the story as I thought about it more. It's still not perfect, as I think there could have been a little more connection between both halves of the game beyond what's presented at the end of the game, and I think Attendants themselves could have been way better as villains. I mean, they do have really good designs and a few memorable personality quirks, but in terms of being legit antagonists, they don't have that much presence and are not all that threatening. But I really appreciate how they explore more of what Septima actually is, and why it can be so dangerous if not kept in check. After what Gunvolt's been through in the last 2 games, I totally believe he would be strong enough to where his power would go crazy, and because a lot of what happens in this game involves him either directly or indirectly, I feel his character is explored in a different way that doesn't involve Joel or anything like that. A lot of the story is told through his perspective, and we get a lot more about what he thinks of the situations more than anyone else. Kirin is more so a vehicle to help Gunvolt along, which makes sense as things are looking very dire for him. It's honestly very impressive how they were able to keep the story more about Gunvolt, despite him not taking center stage in gameplay. But that doesn't mean Kirin is left hung to dry either. She's really got a sense of honor, wanting to help people out through means other than killing, and she can be pretty peppy when she needs to be, reacting to the current conditions of the stage, and having some genuinely fun conversations with Gunvolt and the rest of the cast. The primal dragons you end up rescuing are definitely my favorite set of companions in the series. They're all really funny, have plenty of moments where they interact and acknowledge each other, not just Kirin and Gunvolt, and heck, they even pitch in from time to time in gameplay, which is very refreshing. The writing in general is very enjoyable, letting each character shine in their own way, and giving each moment its own punch, and there's plenty of mid-stage dialogue that contributes a lot more. If only because we actually have an English dub this time. Okay, this technically isn't the first time a Gunvolt game got an English dub, as Luminous Avenger X2 got one first, but hearing just about every bit of dialogue voiced in English really does help. The cast themselves do a great job with the characters given, with standouts easily going to Kelly Baskin as Kirin, who is just radiating with likability, Risa Mi as Shiran, because if I didn't want to hug him before, then I definitely do after hearing that voice.
You know, that reminds me of an attack that recently got nerfed in this fighting game. This isn't a game, this is real life.
Are you sure about that?
And Morgan Berry as Serpentine, who really does nail the sophistication, yet comes off as very unsettling. But getting English dub was one step forward, as now that we're out of 3DS territory, the graphics have seen a significant improvement. Environments are much more detailed, and there's a lot more particle effects going on to give the game more style. I love the after images added to things like Kirin's sword swings and arc chain, and Gunvolt's Voltaic Buster. Kirin, Gunvolt, and all the bosses have several more animations to go around, and some of these can get borderline nuts, especially the special attacks. The added animation to the portraits is also neat. And since we have an English dub, I grew more appreciation for the dialogue sequences outside of stages. I mean, they're not that much different from previous games, and I kinda wish some characters had more portraits, but everything overall just looks a bit cleaner, so they're still good. And hey, they still have plenty of artwork for certain scenes, which look better than ever. One of my favorite details for this is that when you add more members to the team, the art in the stage select menu will actually change to include whoever you rescued, which is a really neat touch. I especially approve of Sharon with his gaming setup and BB napping on the job. I relate to that so much. I am happy to see that they did take an effort to address my criticisms with mid-stage dialogue presentation. The portrait windows are still pretty big, but the dialogue boxes feel just right in terms of size. But more importantly, you can actually adjust the opacity of both of them, as well as turn off voice acting if you just want to focus purely on the gameplay, which was a great call. Music I still think is fine, but thanks to how the Kudo system was changed, Lumen songs play a lot more, and they're definitely great to listen to. Only time I recall the game slowing down was during some boss encounters, where a bunch of attacks, including Kirin's special, were going off all at once. But aside from that, the game ran perfectly at 60 frames per second, which, for a game where so much can be going off on screen, I am thankful for. And it makes it all easier to enjoy actually playing the game, which we're getting into right now. Unlike last time, Kirin and Gunvolt do not have their own separate campaigns. They're both together for this one, with Kirin in the lead and Gunvolt trailing behind. Kirin, in terms of general playstyle, is pretty much the zero of the series. She's got a sword with good range, good damage output, and a 3-hit combo. But the real thing this game wants you to focus on is her arc chain. She can throw Talisman, which can tag enemies like Gunvolt, but unlike Gunvolt, these don't do damage. They do, however, modify how much damage you're going to do when you next strike that particular enemy. To some, this means you just insta-kill them, but others might take a few more Talisman to deal more damage. She can have 7 different tags all out at once, so that's good, but when she has at least one tag out, she can do the arc chain, where she homes in on a target and deals the appropriate damage, and enters a sort of floating state that she can jump out of. This is what the game wants you to use for a lot of encounters, as with the right setup, Kirin can get ridiculously mobile and take out so many enemies at once. It's a ton of fun to use it for enemy encounters, as getting multiple KOs is cathartic, but it can also be used on these chain lance for extra mobility, and you can throw it diagonally up and diagonally down for extra range. Granted, she doesn't have a feature that lets her stay still while aiming with her talisman, so diagonal throws usually happen while you're moving, and let me tell you, I got hit a lot because of contact damage. I'll admit that some bad reactions while trying to take out enemies in a cool way is definitely on me, despite how my brain functions, but still, I get annoyed when I take contact damage, as I do when a projectile remains out, because there's usually so much going on, I usually have a hard time telling what's what. Though, as I did play it more, I eventually started to form strategies of when I should use the arc chain, and when a normal attack would be better, which did help. And like Zero, Keating can get new attacks which can be immensely helpful depending on the situation. She doesn't get as many as Zero would in most Mega Man X games, but I still got plenty of use out of them. As someone who prefers playing as Zero in most Mega Man X games, I gravitated towards Keating very easily. She's capable of a ton when fully decked out, and her arc chain, while very centralized, is a ton of fun to use. And likewise with Coben from last game, it stays true to what Gunvolt was all about, tagging and zapping while staying on the move. But where does that leave Gunvolt? Well, to start things off, you can only play as him when your fetter gauge, that meter that is dictated by that percent right there, has the appropriate amount, which is 100%. You fill this meter up by playing the best as you can with Keating, and you can go beyond that to 300% if you so desire, which will let you play as him longer. But if you got the appropriate amount, you can tag out and run amok. And I mean run amok, because man, Gunvolt's abilities have been kicked into overdrive. The tagging and zapping has been kept the same, and he has this new attack that mimics the arc chain called the Lightning Assault, which can massacre hordes of foes in an instant. The fetters meter sort of acts as both a health bar and a timer. You don't die when it runs out, you instead switch back to Keating when that happens, and the game makes it look like privation is active, but it does deplete the gauge, so it's probably best to dodge anyways. But the ridiculous part is that Gunvolt has infinite jumps and infinite air dashes, kind of like if he were an Anthem. This not only makes platforming with him trivial, but depending on the level, he can completely skip entire sections. Yeah, that's pretty jarring. Now theoretically, if you have enough fetters, you could just blitz on right past enemies and annihilate ones you just so happen to come up against. But that's not something I would recommend doing, as playing as Gunvolt doesn't get you as many points as playing as Keating. Also, most of the time, there's some level you'll have to play since you're on a timer with GV, but most of the time, on the default difficulty standard task, this won't be too hard, and this is where I had to think the most about my overall thoughts. You might have seen in most reviews that one negative listed is how overpowered GV is, and while that's technically not wrong, I don't really feel like that was the intention for story and gameplay reasons, but I think the problem is actually something else. I quite enjoy using GV in this state, as I feel like going nuts with his abilities is a good reward for playing really well, and the fact that he can use different specials depending on how many fetters you saved was great. I kinda like thinking of him as a power-up in this case, something you could do if you want, though you can easily beat the game with just Keating. I think the problem is actually that you have too much access to him on standard task. You not only start at 100% on this meter at the beginning of each stage, meaning you can use him right away, but getting more fetters is not that hard to do if you know what you're doing. I got over 200% easily by stage midpoints, and was able to get 300% before heading to the boss, which to me is a bit much. And if you manage to dodge things well enough with him, that's more time saying bye level! I think this blow would have been softened if the rate in which you filled up this gauge was just a little bit slower to encourage playing a little better, and making sure the player doesn't trivialize everything with no effort. Doesn't help that standard task is the only difficulty until you beat the game, and when we get to the demanding task, the rate in which this grows is much better. Now, this doesn't mean I think demanding tasks should be available from the start, although I wouldn't mind that, but I do think the game could have been a little more restrictive with your access to him. Anthem also returns, but it's seen some changes. Gunvolt now just goes even more berserk with his power, essentially trivializing every enemy, and he also has complete mid-air control and an air dash. The catch is though, if you use too much of this power, or if you get hit by way too many enemies, Gunvolt loses control and essentially says, "This planet!" and just destroys everything, sending you back to the tile screen. I mean, this is unlikely to happen if you're playing normally, but still, it's admittedly kinda creepy, and I like how they made Anthem have a bigger consequence. It's for all these reasons why I try to use Gunvolt as little as possible, only saving him for when Keating is in a tight spot. And it's through her playstyle that I was able to really get the most out of the level design. While every single level is relatively linear, they're able to use the versatility you have to lay out enemies and obstacles in a way where you need to figure out the best method of racking up those points, and give at least a little bit of exploration for health pickups, money, and image chips, which I'll go into in a bit. They also have these special gimmicks that really do add a lot more to how dynamic the game is. For example, Cyber Kowloon has things like shutters, gravity mines, and cameras, which all test how you can use your R-Chain for mobility purposes, with the only punishments being slight damage at worst, and having to add in at least one extra enemy at best. The forest is treated a lot like a stealth section, but the layout of everything is a lot like a puzzle, and you're not sent back to a checkpoint if you get caught. All you have to do is just deal with some enemies and projectiles for a few seconds, keeping the flow in check. The oil refinery has loads of surfaces on fire, but certain projectiles can ignite other surfaces as well, encouraging you to pick your battles carefully. It also has an alternate route you can take that's probably the best example for a reward for exploring. The image chips are probably the biggest incentive you have for looking around the levels, because they reward you with what's known as image pulses. These are fragments of Gunvolt's memory transformed into radiant feathers by keying that can give you more moves that you can activate with the right analog stick, or passive perks like decreasing damage taken, making health pickups heal you more, letting you deal more damage in luminous singing, and even Pervasion. Keating doesn't have Pervasion by default, but after the intro stage, she can equip it as an image pulse, which I'm cool with. It eats up a lot of talisman, and they do need to be regenerated by charging in place, similar to what Gunvolt and Copeland could do, and it still causes a luck to your kudos, but the option is there if you want it. Image pulses are basically a replacement for equipment from the last two games, and every single one is modified after a character featured in them, as well as this one. Mechanically, I really like these, as they can really help you out depending on the circumstance, and the move ones can really do a number on bosses if you use them well. Not to mention having 4 slots for the move ones is handy for multitasking, because maybe you want to let loose with strong attacks, and maybe have 1 or 2 on standby for healing. That was usually my strategy, but I'm glad the game gives you those options. Same with the passive ones, which can cater to how you play the game. You can go for Broken Triad with all that score and damage, or you can play a little more conservatively and try to make sure you're in good condition. And the more slots that open up as you gain levels, the more you have to work with, which does give levels more purpose here. Also, with the money you get in each stage, you can make the rare ones more potent. But I'm not fond of how exactly you get them. It's not as simple as grabbing a single image chip and you get a certain image pulse. If you finish a stage, you're guaranteed at least 2 or 3, while another one is received by collecting all the image chips, and another one can be granted if the boss of this level was revived by this Septima, which is only in specific levels. And I think you get more if you complete a mission on a higher difficulty, though I'm not 100% sure on that one. But the part where I had to do a double take is that with a small handful of exceptions, every single image pulse you receive is completely random. Yes, this is basically a gacha system. Each stage definitely has plenty of image pulses you can get within them, but the only hurdle that's standing in your way is trying to see if you can get those image pulses, while having a chance of getting ones that are duplicates, which turn into money when you get them granted, but since money is only used for these, that means you can just get more money than you know what to do with. Also, yes, you're more likely to get different kinds of image pulses by unlocking the extra difficulties, which is encouraging replayability on those settings, but in terms of trying to collect them all, it ultimately comes down if the game decides to give it to you, which isn't that bad if you're just taking what you can get, but if you're going after absolutely everything, it ultimately comes down to grinding. I do not understand this direction at all. There really isn't an image pulse that completely power creeps another, so you're going to get some useful ones regardless, but this is really asking a lot out of collectors and completionists, and it feels like it was only made this way just because gacha is really popular in this day and age, and for replacing for a system that was kind of grinding in its own nature, this feels a lot more clumsy. Also, with challenges gone, a good chunk of these image pulses are tied to specific stages on specific difficulties. Despite this though, I still think they're handy in preparing for what's ahead. Since they're not exactly factored in, the game will definitely challenge you more if you decide to go vanilla. Gunvolt 3 can legitimately get pretty challenging at a lot of points, as there will be many instances that require a good degree of dexterity and quick reaction times, and some set pieces aren't immediately obvious when you first get to them. Granted, it becomes way harder to die if you equip more image pulses on standard task, but the beginning of the game can legitimately get pretty tough due to lack of them, and when you get into a demanding and especially merciless task, where your image pulses take longer to cool down, you have less health, and your feathers gauge takes longer to charge, things get ramped up considerably. Two of the biggest culprits of this are how the kudos system was changed, and the bosses. In the last two games, depending on how many hits you took, probation or otherwise, any kudos you got would be instantly lost after a while, unless you played on Fearless where they would be lost after 1 hit. Here you always get to keep your kudos unless you retry from your last checkpoint or die, but otherwise if you get hit, a lock is placed on your kudos, and you need to continue playing to get it back up. But the more hits you do take, the bigger the lock amount gets, so it's definitely encouraged to keep on dodging and get in as many hits as you can. This does feel a lot more friendly to less skilled players, and yet, it feels like the skill ceiling the other two games had isn't lost in translation, so I actually really like this change. Bosses are definitely harder from a more general player standpoint, as their patterns aren't immediately recognizable, and their attacks can get really hard to avoid early on, some of which requiring the arc chain. And on the harder difficulties, they both attack faster, and some of their attacks are modified to give you even less room to dodge. That said, I think these are some of the best bosses in this series. Regardless if it's one of the rampaging primal dragons or an Attempts adept, figuring out how to damage them is really fun to do, and there's a sense of energy to them making them feel climactic. Easy standouts go to K-Man as he handles his fight more like a cage match, as he stops you from using the walls to jump on as you go on, and by the final health bar, it's literally a match in a bubble. Serpentine's fight uses various attacks from the primal dragons against you in conjunction with her own, kind of making up for the fact that only the Attempts adepts are refought in the boss rush, and Piranha's got some really inventive ways to use fire and ice that aren't evaporation. And that final boss I won't spoil, but man, as if GV didn't get the short end of the stick already. And even though I won't spoil the ending, I will say that it does do the true ending deal again. but you can get it on your first run through. No replaying the final stages multiple times over just to see how the campaign concludes, just fighting that final boss in a certain way. So thank you for that. With all that said, Gunvolt 3 is definitely a game I had to think about before I wrote any of this down. I mean, with all the points that could be made against it, with access to GV being a bit unbalanced on standard task, with how the image pull system was handled, with certain aspects of the story, and with the fact that while the extra difficulties are great, the secret missions are just the boss fights again, with the token boss rush and nothing else, when it really comes down to the core gameplay, I also think I enjoyed Gunvolt 3 more than the other two games. I was always more of a fan of swords than blasters, and Keating honestly satisfied me as a playable character more than GV and Copen did, and I loved just about every level and how much fun the character interactions were. So much so that I felt more of an incentive to do better here than I did previously, and I already felt some of that with Gunvolt 2. Heck, I barely switched to GV on my second save file, and I ended up getting more out of the experience trying to become better. Will I try so hard to get S++ ranks on everything, including the Merciless missions? No. Heck, I will even admit that taking a step back, I think Gunvolt 3 has bigger flaws than Gunvolt 2, and I can understand why someone would consider Gunvolt 2 to be a better experience. But to me, Gunvolt 3 has higher highs with what it tries to do. The inventive and at times insane set pieces, the memorable bosses, and just the enjoyment of revisiting stages in different ways. Gunvolt 3 is just more fun to me as a video game in general, and I definitely recommend you play this at some point. I don't know how you'll feel to choose to play it before the previous two, as I think there's a lot in this game that'll be appreciated more if you played those two, and I can understand if that $30 price tag is a little bit too big of an ask for you, but rest assured, this is still a great action-packed platformer, and probably my favorite of the three. And hey, if you want more reason to pick it up, Indie Creates has recently announced that they're now doing free content updates for the game throughout the rest of the year, the first of which is out now. So now you can play as Keating that can't use passive image pulses, with a very small handful of exceptions, but has these insane attacks as a trade-off. If you know what you're doing with these, then it becomes less fitting to play Lumen songs over the action, and more fitting to play... And there's a new speedrun mode for Gunvolt that allows him to enter his berserk state whenever he pleases. I didn't get any footage of this one because you have to get Azure Striker ranks on 3 stages to unlock it, which you get by being stages using only Gunvolt and never Keating, but I couldn't even get close to get one. But that's only the beginning. There's going to be new modes, bosses, and an additional epilogue campaign featuring the Attempts adepts, which has me interested. And that final one should be released around the same time at the PC port, so this game's easily got a healthy life ahead of it. So go on ahead, check it out! Oh, the things that can happen when you're editing a video. This has been an enjoyable video to make, as my revisits to Gunvolt 1 and 2 turned out to be rather pleasant as someone who hasn't played them in a while, Gunvolt 1's endgame notwithstanding, and I'm happy that Gunvolt 3 turned out as well as it did, as it was really a great way to close off my journey through what the Azure Striker has been through. They're all really great at giving you some games that are filled with a ton of modern day style, while keeping elements that are classic for a reason. I definitely recommend you give them a shot, and maybe Gunvolt's future may turn out for the better. Now, I'm definitely going to cover the 2 games that spun off from the series, Gunvolt Chronicles Luminous Avenger X1 and 2 at one point, but I think for now I'm going to take a break from this series for a little while. Playing all these within a short amount of time did wear on me a bit, and I have plenty of other videos I want to make, but rest assured, Copen's adventures will definitely get their due. I am Blaine Ripper, and thank you all for watching.